Brother Jason a second to get me hooked up and turned on. We're getting real smooth with this. I don't have to turn this thing on. It's already on. He just turns me up, because he's good. Some people, I suppose, wish they could rather turn me down. Too much. Pride goeth before the fall. Last Sunday evening, I polled the church as to what you would have us go through and study on Wednesday evenings. And the overarching winner was apologetics. And I know some of us probably aren't even well versed into what that would even refer to, because a lot of folks, through no fault of their own, don't rightly even know what apologetics are. And I can prove that to you in a variety of ways, but chiefly among the fact that when we have wronged someone, we often say that we want to go and make an apology rather than saying sorry. Making an apology and saying sorry are not the same things. The word apology is from the same Greek root that we get the word apologetics. And apologetics comes from that word apologia, or apologia, however you want to say it, and it means to make a defense. And sometimes when you're in error, you don't need to make a defense. Sometimes you just need to own up to your error and say sorry. There's nothing wrong with offering an apology. It's just to say in common usage in the English language, we don't know what apologetics is all about. And we don't even know necessarily what it refers to. If you have a Bible, I would encourage you to turn, if you would, to 1 Peter chapter 3. And I would hold your place there and look also at Romans chapter 1. Because, as I said, this is something that I suppose we will kind of dip our toes into. And I really think after this evening you'll come to a point where you might agree with me and why it's a worthwhile study. 1 Peter was written by the Apostle Peter. He was writing to a group of dispersed Christians in Asia Minor. It's what we call one of the general epistles because it wasn't directed to any one congregation or church. It was to have been shared and copied and dispersed amongst the dispersed Christians in what is now Turkey. But if you found 1 Peter chapter 3, notice if you would verse 15. 1 Peter 3:15, he says, "In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." The word there for make a defense is the Greek word apologia. It's where we get the term apologetics. That's what Peter's talking about, that we should always be ready to make a defense. And to the contrary, if you found Romans chapter 1, in that chapter the Apostle Paul is running through a list of things that are nothing less than damnable and condemned by God. And if you found Romans 1 and you notice verse 20, he says, those people that are basically giving God the middle finger and could give a rip about him, he says, that's God, for God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. The word therefore without an excuse, unapologetus in the Greek, it literally comes from the same word. It could literally mean they're without an apologetic. They have no defense. They have no excuse. And so we think about what it means to consider apologetics. With skepticism being so loud and truth being told as relative and subjective, I will tell you that being able to defend our faith is not just optional. It's obligatory. When Paul says that the lost have no excuse for their ignorance and their rejection of God, and Peter commands us to be able to defend what we believe, honestly, there probably isn't anything else that needs to be said to corroborate why we want to study this. But if that wasn't enough, let me share with you some modern statistics, just to give you an idea of where we are as a society. 2 Sundays ago, I said to you that carrying out the Great Commission was for all Christians to do, and not just for preachers and pastors and theologians. Learning not only what you believe, but why you believe it and how to defend it is very, very important, because according to the 2023 and 2024 Pew Research Religious Landscape Survey, there are about 62% of American adults that identify as Christians. Actually, I should probably quote that properly. They said it was 62% of U.S. adults, which maybe you probably know how much not everyone in the United States who is an adult is an American. 62% of adults in the U.S. say that they are Christians. And I know maybe that sounds great. Oh, that's over half, 62%. However, that's down 15% over the last 15, 20 years, because in 2007, it was 78% who considered themselves Christians. It's gone down. And trends have a nasty habit of just following through and doing the same thing over. But if that wasn't indication enough, my generation, actually the generation immediately after mine, I'm 31, 18 to 29, so right after me, among the 18 to 29-year-olds, only 45% identify as Christians, and 44% identify as religiously unaffiliated, otherwise known as the nuns. When you talk about nuns, you're either talking about the ladies that live in a Catholic convent, or you're talking about the people that are unaffiliated. This is N-O-N-E-S, nuns. That's almost half of the next generation of American adults. And if those numbers continue, then the number of Christians are going to be eclipsed by the number of the nuns. And by the way, those who identify as Christians, of course, are not all biblically sound, orthodox, traditionally minded Christians. They might just call themselves Christians. Some of the most wicked people on earth claim to be Christians. Doesn't mean that they are. We've got to do something to course correct, in other words. We need to be able to not only know our faith, but be able to contend for our faith. And during prayer time, Brother Robert was talking about how we've had a lot of people who grew up in the church and have since left the faith. One of the reasons for that is a lack of apologetic, a absolute ignorance of not only the faith, but how the faith stacks up to the rest of the world. I want you to imagine a scenario for a second. It can be a guy or a girl, doesn't really matter, but imagine a person that grows up in a church, let's say a church just like this one. They're taught the basics and the background of Christianity. They're taught the seriousness and the significance of Christ and his church. Maybe they become baptized. They attend youth group and worship services regularly. They go to CYE, church camp. They do all of these things, and then they graduate high school. And let's say they go off into the secular world, or better yet, for the purpose of this exercise, let's imagine they go to post-secondary school. I don't care where you put them in your fantasy. It doesn't matter if it's community college or if they go to a school in the Ivy League. It doesn't matter if they go to the local state school or to trade school. Anywhere and everywhere in between those institutions, they're going to be confronted with the apologetics of the world. They're going to be confronted with the best arguments against Christianity that the world has to offer. And listen, as a teacher, I've heard a lot of parents, even in the church, say that they don't want to force their beliefs on their kids. They want to be respectable, and they want to allow their children to come into their own and develop their own understandings. And that's so nice. And they play patty cake, proverbially speaking, and they don't want to, shove anything on their kids. So they kind of sit in more of a passive position, and they let their kids develop themselves by themselves. The world is not that nice. While you or those folks might want to play patty cake, spiritually speaking, and not force your beliefs on your kids, the world is not going to be so nice. They are not going to be so passive. Because the moment we walk out of our door, we are being assaulted with a blitz of the world's apologetic, the world's arguments against the faith. Make no doubt about it. And I think it's one of the reasons we see so many of the younger generations increasingly more and more walking away from the church. There's not an apologetic to say otherwise because they've never been taught it in the church. Getting back to this analogy of the person in school, let's say that they're in school, again, don't care which one, could be Harvard, could be LSUA, don't care. But they go to a class, and it's an actually in-person class, and they're sitting under the instruction of a 30 or 40-year-old professor for the purpose of argument. Let's call him Professor Lecture Much. And I don't know what Professor Lecture Much teaches, but it could be philosophy, it could be math, it could be science, it could be history, doesn't matter. But this person goes into Dr. Lecture Much's class, and at some point, between an uppity remark and a boring PowerPoint presentation, that professor is going to start espousing things that just take a flaming, well, let me not even put it that way. Let's just say he attacks Christianity without mercy. I was going to say something that was a little irreverent. But to give you an example, it could be through the course of any kind of class you can imagine. He's going to say something like, I know some of you grew up believing the Bible is the Word of God, but do you know that the Bible we have today isn't even built on any originals? But don't you know that that Bible was translated from copies of copies of copies, and we can't even know what the Bible actually said? And what he's doing is he is espousing and parroting and repeating arguments by people like Bart Ehrman. And I've read plenty of Ehrman's work, and I've watched his debates. I've listened to a lot of his stuff. Bart Ehrman is one of these folks out there that is going to cause young people to really question things. And if they don't have a grounding in their faith, he's going to kill their faith. See, he would write books like Lost Christianities, The Battles for Scripture and the Faiths We Never Knew. and my personal favorite, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. You don't need to read it. I'll tell you all about it if you're curious. But Professor Lecturemuch is building his entire presentation or his snarky little comments off of sections like this. This is coming from Bart Ehrman. And by the way, if you think this guy's ignorant, when he reads the New Testament, he reads it in Greek. He's regarded as one of the most renowned and respected scholars in Greek scholarship in the world today. He's like, I want to say he is the chair at Princeton Theological Seminary. If not, he's one of the higher up professors. I think it's Princeton, but don't quote me, which is funny because I think he went to Princeton too. But Dr. Ehrman says this, it's one thing to say that the originals, that is the New Testament manuscripts, it's one thing to say the originals, that which the apostles or who in the New Testament wrote Scripture, it's one thing to say that those are inspired. But the reality is that we don't have the originals. So saying they were inspired doesn't help much unless I can reconstruct the originals. Moreover, the vast majority of Christians for the entire history of the church have not had access to the originals, making their inspiration something of a moot point. Not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. What we have are copies made later, much later. In most instances, they are copies made centuries later. And these copies all differ from one another in many thousands of places. As we will later see in this book, these copies are different from one another in so many places that we don't even know how many differences there are. Possibly it is easiest to put it this way, in comparative terms. There are more differences among our New Testament manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Professor Lecturemuch is going to start espousing that stuff. And that person you're imagining has never heard any of that before in their life. And they might have been going to church for a while. They might have done all those things I alluded to. But if that's the first time they have been confronted with that, they are in now crisis mode. And now their entire earth is, their faith has been shattered, earth-shatteringly attacked. And I will tell you, there are answers to those questions, meaningful answers. There's a reason brilliant and scholarly people in the world are also Christians. You don't have to check your brain at the door of the church house to surrender to Christ. In fact, I would argue you have to do just the opposite if you're going to reject him. But the problem is not that there aren't any responses to that. The problem is that young person has not heard any of them. They've never had these answers. They've never had these questions. And so when they're then in their late teens, early 20s, and they have no choice other than to do their own research with Google as their friend and Google as their guide, they're maybe going to start walking away from the church a little more every day. Conversations and situations and stories like that has happened countless times when our young people go to college. It more or less happened to me at one point at LSUA. And that's why for the last several years, one of the growing trends online is this whole deconstruction thing. I don't know if y'all heard of this, but it's an online thing where YouTubers or online personalities, they deconstruct their faith. Basically, they put their upbringing under the microscope. Most of them end up leaving the church. And they say, oh, I was so wrong here. I didn't know we didn't have any New Testament originals. How stupid was I? Those silly Christians. Don't they know the Bible has been changed? Blah, blah, blah. And on they go. The problem is, while the church is avoiding hard questions, the culture and the world is asking them. And that's why we need to study this, I think. The why. If you're in 1 Peter 3, look at 1 Peter 4. Let me show you another great verse. Peter seems like one of those guys who would say powerful things in one sentence and not be so long-winded like most Robertses are. 1 Peter 4:17 says this, "For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God." And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? It's almost as if to say those crazy hard questions, we don't need to leave it up to the world to ask and answer them. We need to deal with them. That's what he said in the previous chapter when he said, always be ready to make a defense, or always be prepared to give a defense for the hope that is within you, or make a defense. In terms of New Testament reliability, maybe a lot of young people aren't taught that we do have over 5,800 variants in the New Testament. That's why in most modern Bibles, you'll have them at the bottom of the page. The translators will tell you there's a textual variant here, there's a textual variant there. Yeah, there's thousands of them. Of course, modern Bible readers are also not often told that the vast majority, the overwhelming, obnoxious majority of those variants are so minute and so unimportant you can't even translate them into English. And so when we say there's thousands of manuscripts in the New Testament, and it might be something as simple as someone putting the and symbol and spelling out A-N-D to give you just a hokey example. That's not true, but that's the level of minutia that is a lot of New Testament manuscript differences. It's not to say there aren't more substantial differences, there are, but the vast majority of them do not impact the meaning of the text whatsoever. And the vast majority of the New Testament's manuscripts do not affect doctrine at all. It doesn't seem to say that just because we have all these differences doesn't mean that Christ isn't God, doesn't mean the Bible isn't true, all that kind of stuff. We're short on time. We'll have to come back to this next time, I suppose. But in 1 Peter 3, I'm going to direct your attention to that section again. I want to read all of it to you, and maybe we'll come back to it next week. That scenario I painted for you is not an imagination. It's not an isolated case. It is an epidemic. The question is not whether or not our people and our kids will hear arguments against Christianity. The question is whether or not they're going to be ready when they do. And I know maybe some of you are thinking, Jacob, I am retired. Why do I need to know this? Because you got grandkids that are going to college soon. And you've got children that are dealing with children in school that are dealing with this. You've got, every person in this room, I assure you, will be better off by having spent time learning how to defend your faith. It's one thing to know what you believe. It's another thing entirely to be able to explain why you believe it. And I think in so doing, it will deepen your faith in ways that you would not have thought possible otherwise. In his sermon in LeCount 2 Sundays ago, when Brother Seth was preaching, he had talked about how he really didn't start growing as a Christian until he started serving, until he started really putting his hand to the plow himself. And I would stand by the same thing and agree, but at the same time also, you won't really come to the deepest understanding of what you believe until you listen to those who would try and attack what you believe. In a sense, not only to understand their arguments, but to be able to provide a counter-apologetic that would seem to disprove their argument. I know that's kind of hokey, but notice, if you would, verse 13. Wrap this up this evening. 1 Peter 3:13 says, "Now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. But do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that it should be God's will, than for doing evil." There was at least 3 things in that text I'm going to try and exegete and expound for you next time. But I think in that text we see the priority of apologetics. We see the preparation and the posture of apologetics. We'll have to look at that next time. I think it'll be an illuminating study for you. But here's what you can do in the interim between now and next week. You can go study more 1 Peter chapter 3, and you can be praying and thinking and pondering right now what you need to be equipped to make a defense for. Because when you look at the label of apologetics, oh, Brother Jake's going to do a series on apologetics, that's a little bit of a broad term, because that can refer to everything as essential as basic tenets of Christianity, you know, the existence of God, the deity of Christ, the legitimacy and the historicity of the resurrection, to why Islam is a false god, a false religion, or why Mormonism is a cult, or why Jehovah's Witnesses are just kind of cracked. Apologetics is a vast umbrella thing that can refer to all sorts of things that we need to be able to recognize and understand and deal with. I said you can be praying and wondering and pondering. I want you to think in the interim time what you need to be able to better defend. Because I don't suppose many of us are going to be dealing with a lot of Muslims in Turkey Creek, but you never know. Should you need me to tell you why Islam is not the way, then we can study that. If you need to think about some other things, do that. And the reason I say as much is after I finish expounding 1 Peter 3 for you as a means of introduction to apologetics, I want to then spend a few weeks, if we need, however long you would like, I'm here to serve you, trying to give you a chance to learn how to defend this stuff. And yes, we're going to do New Testament reliability. I'm going to tell you why Bert Ehrman is dead wrong. And we're going to look at that probably really soon. But be thinking. I had someone approach me and talk to me about someone who's not a believer. How do I deal with that person? Maybe you have a dear friend who thinks that the head of the church on earth is a guy with a funny hat in Rome. Why is that not right? Why do the Jehovah's Witnesses have a different Bible? All these kinds of things revolve around the conversation of apologetics. And I'm going to also ask that you pray for me, because it's going to be one of those instances where it's not a hard thing for me to realize what we could say. It's going to be more difficult then to realize what we need to leave out, what we need to spend time on, because it's a lot. It's a lot. Be thinking about that. I hope this might have piqued your interest. If not, be praying about it and try and think of something that you would need me to teach you how to defend. with God's grace, I think you'll be better off by doing so. Thank you for your attention this evening. Brother Keith.